My name is Patrick Rahul. I'm Cloud Solution Architect. I'm in the same team as Steph, Isaac, and John. I work for a unit called Customer Success Unit, and basically we focus on app and innovation. So my focus area is to work with the customer on their cloud journey on Kubernetes, app modernization, serverless, and microservices. So today we're going to talk about Azure Function. Now, what areas we will cover on Azure Function is, first we'll start with what exactly Azure Function is, how does it work, how does Azure Function work, what is the architecture behind the Azure Function. We also look at hosting option of Azure Function. Very important when you're looking for scalability, when you're looking for memory management, hosting option is very important. So we'll look into that part. Operating system. So Azure Function supports both Windows and Linux. So we'll see when to use what, when to use which operating system. We'll do the comparison between those. Timeout duration, again, very important when you're running a function, whether you need like 4 hours of some processing, how would you design that? What kind of hosting option you choose? So we'll talk about that in detail. Scaling behavior, right? So if you have designed a microservice and if you are deployed to Azure Function as an endpoint, just to, let's say, order processing, how would you scale it? So if on weekend, if you're getting thousands of requests, how do you scale your Azure Function? And the cold start behavior. So cold start is basically when you have Azure Function, which is silent for, let's say, 1 hour, when a new request comes in, whether it will process it faster or will it take time to start it. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about billing option again, how much you're going to pay when you use it. And finally, we're going to see a demo, a live demo. I have built a demo using GoCardless, which is a direct debit collection company, right? So how do you integrate direct debit payment with business application, for example, your sales application or SAP or Dynamics 365 using Azure Function. So we'll have Azure Function integrating GoCardless application with a third party and business application like SAP. Now, what exactly Azure Function is? So Azure Function is a serverless service offering from Azure, from Microsoft, and it is basically event-driven programming code where you run your code independently. Yeah. Again, Azure Function is a code plus event and data, right? So you can think about it as a code with event and data. So you have written some code. It can be PowerShell, it can be C#, it can be Ruby, it can be Python. And how do you trigger it? So that is the event. And what do you do with the data? So you have event plus data, and you have code, so you run your code. Now, the main key feature, it is event trigger. When I say event trigger, take an example of service bus integration. So if you have a service bus, whenever there's a new item in the queue or new item in the topic, you want to trigger the Azure Function. Or if you have Cosmos DB, if you have a new item in there, how do you trigger it? HTTP trigger. So we're going to talk about trigger. So it is event trigger based programming. It's pay as you go. If your function is not running, you don't pay it. It's when your function is executing it regularly, then only you pay it. So pay as you go. Multi-language support. As I said, you can run almost all of the languages. You can run Python, F#, Ruby, R, C#, PowerShell. So language independent. You can run on Windows as well as on Linux. It's a cross-platform. And serverless. Of course, you don't need virtual machine to host your Azure Functions. You can just go and spin up your Azure Function resources. Now, how does Azure Function work? Yeah. So it is basically an input and output binding concept. So for example, you have Azure Function here. So you would need a trigger. Triggers are what cause a function to run. It could be any trigger. We talk about trigger in detail, but triggers are what cause a function to run. And binding is, which to a function is a way of declaratively connecting your resources with the function. So it could be any resource, for example, Cosmos DB or Service Bus or even Grid. Now in here you have a Azure SQL database, which is input. Then you're running an Azure function, and Azure function is then pushing data back to Azure database, or it could be any other system. So another slide where I want to explain how Azure function works. So for example, you have triggers, right? It could be Service Bus, HTTP trigger. So you want to have a webhook. So you can expose your Azure function as a webhook with HTTP endpoint, and your consumer can trigger that. You can have time trigger. So you want to run that job every 5 minutes or every 1 hour. You can time trigger it. You can queue trigger it. Event Hub, you can use it to trigger that. So these are the various sources where you can trigger your Azure function. With each trigger, you get different binding. So here you have, let's say you have code here. So when trigger is causing Azure function to run, it will pass some data into this. It could be your service bus topic as a JSON. It could be XML. It passes data. It wraps the input data into an object, and it passes into the code. And it is all secure. You will not. It's all secure data, which is not passed lightly to HTTP without HTTPS, right? Finally, what function will do is it will do its job. Whatever code you're written, it will do its job, and it will unwrap the data again and pass it on to the target. And target could be any, for example, you want to insert record into Cosmos DB, blob storage, again Service Bus, Event Hub, additional. What a demo will see is, here we will see on the demo HTTP trigger, which is coming from GoCardless. So GoCardless payment, the direct debit payment, the demo, I'm talking about the demo. So when GoCardless receives payment for your direct debit, it will notify Azure function via HTTP trigger, and Azure function will go and update my Dynamic 365 app saying this particular user has made the payment. Or if payment is failed, it will notify saying payment failed due to insufficient balance or due to user stopped the direct debit, right? So that's a demo I'm going to show. So here you have trigger, and the other side you have target data. So target data, here you use again connector, different connector. You can use Python code, PowerShell, C#. Hosting options. There are various hosting options. Very important to consider being a solution architect or developer. You have to learn about those things. So there are 3 basic plans and 2 advanced plans. Yeah. So the hosting plan you choose dictates the following behavior. So it depends on the hosting plan, how your function app is scaled. For example, in the consumption plan, if you compare consumption plan with the premium plan, the scalability is higher, and we talk about that in detail. So based on your basic the hosting plan, the function will scale up based on your hosting plan. The resources available to each function app instance. So based on a hosting plan, for example, you want to add Azure function to your virtual private cloud. You cannot add it to the networking, you cannot add it to the firewall in a consumption plan. You have to go with the higher plan. So based on the hosting plan you choose, that will decide the resource available to it. It also supports advanced functionalities such as virtual private network. And now let's look at the different hosting plans available. As of now, there are 5 plans. The basic plans is, number 1 is consumption plan, which is by default, very, very reasonable price. First 1 million hits to the functions are free. Microsoft will not charge you for 1 million hits, but there are discounts. So default hosting plan, when you create function, pay only when your functions are running. When functions is not triggered, it is not running, you don't pay for it. Scales automatically even during periods of high load. It does scale, yeah, but there is a limitation on that. The second plan is premium plan, which is quite famous for the enterprise customer. Here, the function app continuously runs, which means in this case, the cold start behavior you will observe here. But in case of premium plan, you will not observe the cold start because it is continuously running. When a new function comes, it will pick it and within a few seconds. But here in this case, your code will start building up again. So it is a cold start thing. Provides more CPU and memory. So compared to consumption plan, you get more CPUs. You can choose how many cores you want and how many memories you want during the consumption plan. So for example, if you need 32 cores or 4 cores, you can choose here, but that feature is not available. And provides more execution time. The default timeout of consumption plan is like 10 minutes or 6 minutes, but this premium plan is you can execute for 1 hour or so. We'll talk. We have the table in detail, and then dedicated plan. So dedicated plan is basically using your own virtual machine to host your Azure function. Right? You are not hosting your Azure function on the default Microsoft resources, but you are using your own VM to do that. Why people do this? Why they go to dedicated plan? There are multiple reasons. Number one is if you have a virtual machine which is not utilized as you want, and let's say it has a good capacity, and you needed some function to run on very high load data, let's say a Python code running on millions of record, and you want to process it faster, you can go with a dedicated plan. So allows you to use underutilized VMs that are already running other app services instance, but additionally you can host yours using dedicated plan. Provide a custom image on which you run your function. So here is default image. Microsoft gives you, in this case, dedicated plan. You can build your image. You can build your VM. And in dedicated plan, you get predictive scaling and cost. So definitely compared to these two, cost is slightly higher. Any other question on the consumption? Because yesterday, my customer came to me saying that, hey, I want to add my Azure function with the VPC, virtual private cloud VPC, and they were using consumption plan, so it is not possible. Right? So you have to, being a solution architect, you need to know. And the other two important plans are basically, these are advanced plan, we call it as app service environment and Azure Arc. Right? So you can run your Azure function as a container. App service, we call it ASE, very high scale, full compute isolation and secure network access. The compute is fully isolated. You have full control where you want to run it. Huge memory uses. You can go up to GBs like if you want to. Again, the Director Azure Arc, custom hardware requirement, isolation and secure network access. Again, this ability to run it in hybrid or multi-cloud environment. So if you want to run it in on-prem or any other cloud, you can use that. And run alongside existing Kubernetes application and services. So if you already have high AKS application and you want to run Azure function as a part of those application or microservices, you can plug it into that. So that's a new plan which was launched like a few years ago. Yeah, so these are the hosting plans. Operating system. I just put a table. I'll distribute this deck, but you can see with each plan what are the different languages and the operating system. For example, in consumption plan, for Docker container, there is no support. You can use all the languages. For example, dedicated plan, you have more support. If you want to run PowerShell, consumption plan, there is no support for that. You need to use PowerShell here. Yeah, PowerShell core. Simple table, but yeah, helpful value design. Again, timeout. As I said, consumption plan In version 3.x, it is 5 minutes. So after 5 minutes, your Azure function will time out if you're using consumption plan. But if you're using premium plan, it can go up to 30 minutes. Minimum is 30 minutes, maximum, there is no limit on the premium plan. Same as ASE. HTTP trigger function timeout is 230 minutes. This is because of ideal timeout for Azure load balance.
I have a question around the hosting. So you can run the Azure functions on the app service plan. So app service plans, you have all those like basic, standard, premium, isolated. So where does it fit in this comparison?
Yeah, so the app service plan starts with basic and standard. But
And then you have premium and isolated.
Yeah, so those are here.
So is it premium or is it ASE or both?
So the for Azure function, the basic and standard is combined into one consumption plan. So it uses the same service plan, but when you are provisioning an Azure function for that, you will have option of consumption plan rather than basic and standard.
Yeah. So the normal app service plan, the standard or premium, is it like on this grid? Is it considered as a premium?
So the basic and standard are considered as a consumption. App service premium is premium here.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So basic and standard are combined into this one.
Yeah.
So that question leads to this thing, right? So if you have your app service plan, right, or say standard plan, and if you want to deploy your Azure function, at that point, it will give an option of consumption plan, because technically then I am posting it on a server that I'm paying for, right? So how does that work then?
So you have to have a separate, so you use the same Azure service plan or app service plan, but it configures it slightly differently in case of Azure function. Whether you're using app service or Azure function, based on that, the plan will differ.
No, but then there's a costing issue, right? So I was just looking at this evening. So your premium plan is £142 per month, right? But if I was to go with the P1 V2, it's £154 or whatever that number comes to, right? So what would be that difference then? So I'm a bit confused now.
So can you repeat?
So if I was going with the app service plan, right? So P1 V2 is £154, right? And premium plan for Azure functions is 142. So how does that work then?
So app service is a different service because you're hosting a full, you can host full web application there, right? Azure function is event driven. It's a small one function code, right? So it uses the same service plan, but the configuration of that is different because it doesn't need timeout on the web application. For example, app service would not need timeout setting. So it uses the same service plan, but structurally it is, John, I mean, app service plan and Azure service plan, they are both separate.
No, they are same because you can propose app service on app service plan together with two Azure functions, and it's all on the same like hosting infrastructure.
It uses the same service called app service plan, but the configuration of the app service plan will differ whether you're using Azure function or app service.
What you're trying to say is you can't have your web app and your function app together
in the same plan.
Yeah,
you can.
You can. Yeah.
I think what Patrick's trying to say, and I don't have detail, is that you can use an app service plan or you can use a premium one, but they might just have different limits and different scalability targets. But yeah, under the hood, they do the same thing, but the pricing and the scaling might be slightly different because one's geared towards delivering web apps, but it's being used by functions, but the other one is just purely a functions thing. And we would have to look on the pricing calculator.
John, that confused me as well.
There's one app service plan that you can. Probably you are just deploying app service plan, standard, and you call it app service P1,
P1, yeah.
whereas, and then you just deployed one artifact in Azure. And on this, depending on how wide you will go, you can deploy like 10 different Azure functions and 2 app services. And they will all work on this one Azure artifact.
Yeah, I don't necessarily think you can have a premium functions plan that can service web. So,
No, you can't.
You can't.
It's
So
fine.
I think that, so I don't know the answer, but the
Yeah.
logical answer
Yeah.
would be that they can be fairly much more aggressive in the limits and things that they put onto the functions. And therefore, that's why it's in the difference in price, because they can sort of recycle that infrastructure a lot more easily when they're running function than when they're running. So if there are 2 different plans with 2 different prices, that would explain why the function is slightly
I could fit that up with you.
Yeah. Yeah, so we're talking about the timeout. The scaling behavior, again, max number of instances, it can go up to 200. Premium, then dedicated, ASE, and so max number of per instance. Here it varies by cluster, so it depends on the cluster. But again, ASE is more manual. Cold start, we talked about it. So app may scale to 0 when ideal, meaning some request may have additional latency at startup. When you when more messages are coming into, it will take some time to start up. In premium, always warm instance to avoid any cold start. In dedicated, it is exactly the same. So isn't really an issue. And again, ASE. But in case of Kubernetes, it really depends on the configuration of your container. Or the configuration, whether you are putting the instance or restarting the instance. And billing, right? So we'll be talking about the billing, but you can look at this. So again, consumption, you pay only when your function is running. But since in premium plan is based on number of core seconds and memory used across needed and pre-warmed instances. So when you choose premium plan, there will be pre-warmed instances running always. So the cost is always higher. At least one instance per plan must be kept warm at all times, and this provides additional premium price. So you can think about, because 24 hours the warm instance is running, you pay for additional. But in case of Kubernetes and ASE, it all depends on how you. So a flat monthly rate is applicable. In case of ASE, a flat monthly rate is applicable. Right? Have you looked at comparison? I mean, yeah. So which plan are you going?
So what my plan was basically to aggregate all my function requirements across the organization and then put it under a P1, P2, V3 plan.
Yeah.
And then go with the 3-year reservations. That was the solution. I think.
So yeah, now let's look at the demo. So we have, yeah. Now if you look at, so what I've built is a simple event. I think everyone understands. But it's a membership provider company where they charge member and yearly fees, but they charge it. So it's a yearly subscription, but they pay monthly. So every month there will be direct debit. So when member joins via website, they choose the plan, gold, silver, bronze, and they set up the direct debit for that. Now, what will happen when they do this is companies is using GoCardless for the monthly payment. So we're going to set up now. GoCardless will have all the detail about the customer. So in Azure Function, we don't store any customer information like bank account or anything. It is all with the GoCardless. And when GoCardless collects payment from their bank, direct debit, based on the collection, it will send event to Azure Function, whether it is a failed payment or payment was successful or there was some problem with the direct debit. And based on that, we will update the CRM system. Yeah. So simple architecture, GoCardless, when they collect money from bank, they send event using webhook. So our Azure function is hosted as a HTTP binding, and Azure function will then update dynamic 365. So that's the function. Let's see the demo. Okay, so this is my dynamic 365. Okay, I have all my customer here, and in my customer, let's say I change payment to this one. Right? So we take the payment status and payment remarks. Okay. Now I go into GoCardless. This is my GoCardless account. This is company's GoCardless. Since I have a demo version, so this is sandbox GoCardless, and I can see my customer here. There is only one customer, C1. This is the unit, and this customer has got Barclays Bank as a direct debit setup, and then they have this membership fees for £10, right? So net is 9.64. This is the payment ID. So GoCardless, what we will do is in the GoCardless, you can configure a webhook. So in my case, we have this function as a webhook, and this is the secret. Right? Now let's go to Azure function. So this is my function app. The function app is called PRD365 Direct Debit. And in that function app, I have got one function called Direct Debit Webhook. Yeah. Now the Direct Debit Webhook is this is the URL. Right? That is configured here as an endpoint of the web. This is the webhook endpoint, and this is the right. Now, what would happen? So let's say if I go here and I want to trigger our since it is sandbox, GoCardless does provide sending test webhook. Okay, so I'll pick up the I'll go to there. I'll go to payment, and this is paid out. I'll get the payment ID. I'll go to developer section of GoCardless and I say send a test webhook. Now here I choose the webhook endpoint. So in my case it is demo 1. I want to set up. I want to call the webhook, look for the resource payment. Action is let's say payment paid out. Cause payment paid out. And this is the log. This is the payment. This is what webhook will be triggered when there is an event in the code. So now you can say the information is passed. If I go back to my dynamics, this is the form. So if I refresh, you can see the status changed to paid and payment has been collected. Right? Now, let's say if I go back to this test webhook and send another webhook saying payment failed. So to the link such as submitting failed. Okay. And what is the cause? Bank account closed. Okay. So payment failed for this. I can choose and pass the right. I send it again. Now as Azure function has triggered, I will refresh this, and you can see payment failed for this. So you continuously get event from GoCardless, and your Azure function will trigger. Now let's see the execution of Azure function. So this is Azure function, and this is the Azure function configuration. within Azure portal, since I have associated app service, app insight with the Azure function, I can see all the events here. Though it appears after 5 minutes, the app insight collects data before it displays here, it takes some time. But you can see this was executed at 24. Now, when you go in here, you can see it triggered what was the payment type, what was the resource type, payment. But you could also use, for example, mandate. When bank mandate is created, you can trigger. So this is resource type payment, paid out, and I have updated the account, right? So you can always monitor whether it was successful or not. The monitoring again, yeah, because it has got an app service associated with it. So if you go back here in the resource, this is my app insight. Now, app insight will show you there is no failure, and these are the success right? So you can monitor everything through the app insight. Now, let's look at the code. So my code is basically I've written it's a C# code, but you can choose anything. So this is my function app. I'm storing some data, for example, secret access token. Then you can configure. I'm using Dynamic 365 because I'm connecting to Dynamic 365 to update the customer information. But yeah, this is how you can. Now, how exactly you retrieve data? So if you look at the definition of this function, it is task action result. You have authorization level. It is a post, right? And within the context, you can get everything from the header. So in the request header, because it is a HTTP request, I get all the information, and then I pass this through this function process event, where I can get all the detail from the request form. So I check first the request header, whether the request header contains the secret. So if you look at my GoCardless webhook endpoint, this secret. So whenever webhook triggers this function, first thing I need to check is whether it's a valid GoCardless. So I check with that security or the secret keys, and based on that I can then perform. Yeah. Now let me try to create a new function. So I want to show you how this binding and all you can use. So if I go and say create new Azure function, add new Azure function, I'll name it as my new function. Here you have option to choose the trigger point, whether you want a time trigger or HTTP trigger or service bus queue. You will also have SQL input binding, log, event grid. Yeah. Now let's say you want to use in my GoCardless, I use HTTP, but I want to use service bus here. You can define the connection string. You can get the connection string from Azure Service Bus, define here, and what is the queue name, right? And based on that, so once you create that, now we can see the function. It is a service bus trigger, and this is the connection string. Okay. Whereas the previous function, if you go and look at the signature, it is HTTP trigger. Okay. And here it is service bus trigger, and you define the connection string here. Also the queue name, so that whenever there is a new message in the queue, it will pick up and the function. Yeah, that's it. Any question on the implementation part? And just last thing, if you look at the service plan for this function, this is the function here. So This is my service plan. So I'm using Windows. So no, only one app. Yeah, that's it. From my side.
Sorry, I've got a question.
Yeah.
What are the most common gotchas for if somebody would start to use as a Azure function? What are the sort of common gotchas that people get wrong or abuse or they're into don't do this, if you're thinking in the conventional sort of way, sort of perspective, I think, because there are different ways to look at it, always thought in that way, sort of request response like this.
Yeah, the main thing what people go wrong is around choosing the hosting plan. Convention plan. You would really have to see what kind of scalability you need for your Azure function. How many times your Azure function will trigger in a minute or in a day. Based on that, choosing the right hosting plan is essential. Also, using if you are using, whenever you create a new Azure function, it creates a storage account for that function. If you are sharing that storage account with multiple Azure functions, the performance will not be. So you will really get into trouble. So these are the low-level design things which you have to look at it. From the high-level perspective, it depends on what kind of binding you are using, how you want to actually write your code. The other thing is putting security around the function. For example, if it has to be triggered, anybody go and post message to you, right? So how do you secure your inbound and outbound messages to the function? Anything else?
Just a quick comment if somebody is interested in starting with this. The difference between the hosting on Linux and Windows, like it's important on development and initial test because you can remove debugging exactly execution from your Visual Studio, which is a very cool feature, but it works only if the hosting plan is Windows. You can't do this on Linux.
You have to choose the right operating system and you.
But production can be run on Linux because you don't
need
debug production.
Yeah.
You shouldn't.
Yeah, maybe just PowerShell one, you can't run it on Linux. But most of the time, you've got some level of choice. It should be cheap on Linux.
Yeah.
Should be.
And another cool feature that is all this Azure function, if you set the identity, the automatic identity, you can integrate with the keyboard and for all the secrets that you need for the spike payment or logging to the dynamics are being stored securely in the keyboard, and Azure function is just bringing this in and you just scripting the configuration and everything can be done as infrastructure as a code when you are deploying this infrastructure.
And that's a relatively common thing with lots of Azure services now. If you need to grab in secrets, the function or whatever service itself, you can attach it in an AD identity, and you use exactly so use that to then get to something like keyboard rather than trying to stick credentials and secrets inside the configuration, because with an admin that's even though it's not public, if you've got a rogue admin, you're exposing something. So.
And also like simplifying the deployment of the infrastructure of the DevOps.
Yeah.
You need to get that.
Yeah.
Just one thing, Patrick. I heard one of the slides you talk about the flat fee for the app service environment.
Yeah.
That doesn't exist for a V3. You don't pay a stamp fee as it was known in V3. Yeah. So re-architected base under the hood.
Yeah.
So it didn't cost the engineering team half as much money to run it.